So yeah, for the permissions for Windows 10, they say here Windows provides two sets of permissions to restrict access to files and folders. Of course, we've got NTFS permissions, which remember you get on using the security tab. We zoom in a little bit more here for those guys that are streaming on their phones. Okay, so yeah, so it's on the security tab. This is permissions that are inherited, like we all know, but remember also that inheritance can be disabled at any level. So it's something that we have to keep in mind. Okay, so they give you all the different permissions that you get under NTFS. And of course, also remember you get very advanced permissions if you click on the advanced button. And this gives you what they call granular. So much more finely picked permissions that you can apply to a user. And then, of course, the other permissions that we also talked about was the share permissions. And these are applied to shared folders. So that's the first thing that we have to remember is that NTFS permissions are applied to files or folders on the local PC. And that share permissions are applied to a shared folder that they can, of course, can be accessed over the network. So there's very basic share permissions because it's been around, wow, forever. I think since Windows like 95 has these permissions been set. So that's why NTFS is better to use in all business applications, but you still need to set share permissions as well when you are doing networking. Okay. So yeah, and of course this can also be done if you go to the sharing tab of the folder or the file properties. You can then set the share permissions for that specific folder. Okay. Now the important part is this little red section here at the bottom that I've highlighted for you guys in that Word document. These are what we call the rules. So this is what I wanted to work through, show you guys maybe an example of two as we go through it, so that we can just get that understanding of how this actually works. Okay, so they say rule number one, if the file is accessed locally, meaning you're sitting in front of the computer, only the NTFS permissions are used to determine the user's level of access. So when they're talking about in the exam about a question that might have user or local user accounts, accessing a folder or doing whatever in permissions, or a local group, okay, local group account, then only NTFS permissions actually apply. So we don't care about the share ones, they completely go out of the window, and we just concentrate on the NTFS permission portion of that question. Okay. Rule number two, if the file is accessed through a share, meaning they're connecting it through a network, or in the question you might have using a domain account, then NTFS and share permissions are both used. So now we're taking for both NTFS and the share permissions, and we are going to combine them, and we combine them to find the most restrictive permission. So we take share ones, we take NTFS ones, we throw them together, and we look at to see which ones are the most restrictive, which ones have got the lowest level of permission, and then those permissions are actually applied to that user. So they give you a little example here. If the share permission is set to read access, and the NTFS permission is set to modify access, so modify, of course, is a lot higher than just read. But when we combine the two, what we're going to get? We're only going to get the lower one, the read permission. No. So the user's effective permission level will then be read and not modify. But if they access it locally, then the permission will be modify. Because remember, locally, NTFS only. And the NTFS permission is modify. Rule number three, a user's individual permissions combine additively with the permissions of the groups that the user is a member of. So what we mean here is that if one user account belongs to multiple groups, all the permissions assigned to those groups are then combined, and the highest permission is actually then accepted or taken as what the user can do. So again, they give you the same type of example. If the user has read access to a file in, let's say, the marketing group, but then also that same user belongs to the sales group, and for that group they have modify, so for read for the marketing, modify for the sales, when we combine them, now we take the highest permission, which in this case, modify. Okay, so opposite of when the guy connects over a network is if that user account belongs to multiple groups. Okay, rule number 4. Permissions assigned directly to a particular file or folder, remember, explicit permissions, takes precedence over inherited permissions from the parent folder. Okay, so if we have a folder with a subfolder, okay, whatever permission we apply to the parent gets inherited to the child by default, unless we block the inheritance. But if I then go later and I actually go to that folder and I set a specific permission on that folder, we call that explicit, then that permission will override the inherited permission. Okay. And then the last rule, explicit deny permissions. So if you explicitly deny the modify command, this will take precedence over explicit allow permissions. So think of again when the guy belongs to two groups, sales and marketing. For the sales group, he has the allow to modify, but in the marketing group, he has the deny to modify. The deny will win. Okay. In 99% of the cases, deny will always override allow. Except there's one little exclusion to that rule, where deny will not always override allow. And that rule is, okay, let me just find it here. Explicit allow permissions take precedence over inherited deny permissions. Because remember, explicit will always override inherited. Deny will always override allow. But if I have an explicit deny that I've inherited, if I've got an inherited deny, but an explicit allow, the explicit will overwin and take over the deny permission. So 5 quite simple, basic little rules that if you keep these rules in mind, it will just give you a much better understanding of how permissions work. And when you get that question in the exam, you can actually work it out. Okay. So what I've been was also thinking is, after I've explained it, is quickly just to maybe do 1 or 2 examples of each of these rules, just so that we maybe for those, again, visual learners, so that they can have a bit of a better understanding, hopefully. So, okay, there's really nothing I can do on the first rule. If we access it locally, then it is through an NTFS share. But if we access it through the network, then we use the fetch or the share permission. So maybe one thing that we can do is, if we do a little drawing like this, where we say there is a folder, okay, and you can either access that folder locally, can't spell today, locally, or you can access it through the network. If the dude is on this side and he accesses the folder, then we use the NTFS permissions. But if the person is at the network and he wants to access that folder, then we use the share permissions. Okay, so quite simple. Of course, remember here, share and NTFS. I mean, not to get the rules wrong here. Okay, so that's the first little rule. Quite simple. Okay, let me just clear this. Let's have a look at what the second rule is. Okay, so if the file is accessed through a share, NTFS and share permissions apply, and the most restrictive permission applies. Okay, so let's see how that might look like. Okay, so again, we've got a folder. On this side, we've got the local PC with the guy. And on this side, we have a network with another person sitting on this side. Okay, so here we now have our folder. So they say if this folder has got NTFS permissions of, let's say, modify, but he also has a share permission of read, okay? If the user logs in locally, they will get the modify permission because only NTFS will be taken into consideration. But if the user logs in through the LAN, then we take both the modify and the read, meaning both the NTFS and the share permission. We look at both of them and we see which one is the most restrictive. Okay, so which one has the lowest level of permission, which in this case means that the user will then have the read permission. Cool. Just going to pause the video here for a second. Okay, so let's have a quick look at rule number 3. A user's individual permissions combine additively or gets added with the permissions of the group that that user is a member of. So what that means is, if we have a user and this user has a user account, but this user belongs to, let's say, 3 different groups. We'll have the sales group, it can belong to the PR group, and that person can belong to the HR group. Okay. Those 3 groups were given permission to a folder. Those permissions are, and the group permission, that user will have the read permission on that file. In the PR, let's say they will also have the read permission, but in the HR, that person will have the modify permission. When we now need to find what is the actual permission that this user has, we will take all the groups that they belong to and add them together. Meaning, we'll take the read permission from the sales group, we'll take the read permission from the PR group, and we will take the modify permission from the HR group. And we will now see which one has the most permissions or the most control. And in this case, modify, because it's higher up in the permission level, will then be the actual permission that that user will have on that specific folder. Okay. So all the permissions in all the groups are added together, and we find the permission in this case which has the most control, the highest level of permissions. Okay, so that's that little rule. Let's clear the canvas. Let's see what the next one is again. Permissions assigned directly to a particular file or folder, which we call explicit, takes precedence over inherited permissions from a parent. Okay. So this time we will have, let's say, multiple folders. Let's say we've got 2 folders. Let's keep it nice and simple. Okay. This is what we'll call the parent, and this one is the child. Whatever permission I apply to the parent folder, let's say modify permission for the user Luke, that permission will be inherited. No, I can't spell inherited, so I'm just going to say that. Inherit, something like that, whatever. To the child folder. So for the same user Luke, they will have the partition or the permission, sorry, of modify. So that is inheritance. The second part there, which is the next rule, I think we'll work them together, is that we also get explicit permissions. Now, what is an explicit permission? An explicit permission is a permission that I give to a user, in our case, Luke. But let's say I give this permission to Luke and it's only a read permission. According to the rule, explicit is better than inherited. Meaning, explicit was read, inherited was modify. So explicit will always win. Doesn't matter what the permission is. Okay. Even if this permission was, let's say, instead of read, it was full control. That user will then have the full control permission because it always takes the permission from the explicit rather than the inherited. Okay. So let's finish off and have a look at the last rule. Explicit deny permissions takes precedence over explicit allow permissions. Okay. Except for that one rule, explicit allow will then take precedence over inherited deny. Okay. So let's see how that will look if we try to draw that out. Okay, so we'll have a folder. Okay, let's say this folder has got both explicit and that folder has inherited permissions. Okay, let's give it some permissions. Let's say that it had the read permission was allowed here on explicit. Let's say the modify permission was deny. I'm not saying that these permissions make sense. I'm just writing permissions down. Okay. On the other side, let's say that inherited, we had the read was now denied. You guys can't really see that. Sorry, my camera's in the way. So let me write it up here. And let's say on this side, the modify was allowed. Okay. Stupid photo of me is in the way. So let's try and figure this out. So they say the two rules are deny is always better than allow. So if we take a look at our little drawing here and we combine the permissions, a user logs in. Oh, actually, let's do this. This will make a little bit more sense. Okay, let me do one more thing. Let's say we've got one user, but that user belongs to multiple groups. Okay, this will make it a bit easier to actually explain. Okay, so let's do this now. Let's add a little bit more stuff. So in group 1, they have those permissions. In group 2, let's say they have some other permissions. I'm trying to think of something that will be easy. Let's give it right. Has been allowed. And let's say for this group 3, we have list as also allowed. And then, of course, we need to do the same thing for this side inherited. So that's for group 1. For group 2, let's give them the right permission of deny. And let's give them on group 3 the read permission of allow. It doesn't really matter by now. Okay. Ooh, so this looks a little bit more complicated now. Hey. But now we're combining everything to see if we can get a little bit of understanding, concentrating on the explicit versus deny scenario. Okay. So deny always overwrites allow. So if we have a look at explicit permissions only at this point in time, Okay. You can see that we have one deny under modify. So by combining all the permissions of all the different groups, where we see that we will have read, we have modify, we have write, and we have list, because we have all the three groups that the user belongs to. Modify has been denied. So if we had an allow somewhere else along here, let's say just for this case that in the group 3, he also had the modify, but that case it was allowed to modify. Okay, it's getting a little bit dirty on this board now. Deny will overwrite allow, and that permission will basically be taken away. Okay. Let's have a look on this side. So on inherited, we have read, which was deny. We have modify, which was allowed. We have write, which was deny. And we had another read, which was allow. So that's that one, and those permissions. Okay, so as we can see already here, there's a conflict of the two read permissions of different groups. We follow the rule, deny will always overwrite allow, so that bottom permission will fall out or will fall away. Okay. So that's how you look at the deny versus allow. If the user belongs to multiple groups, don't think now about explicit versus allow, or sorry, explicit versus inherited. Just think of the user belonging to one group, and that group has multiple permissions, but maybe the same permission might be the same from different groups. The denied permission will always be the winner and overwrite and basically get rid of or delete the lesser permission, or in this case the allowed permission. Okay. Now that one rule states, let me just clear the board here a little bit so it looks a bit better. Now that one rule states, very simple, that deny will always overwrite allow, except for the one case where an explicit allow will overwrite an inherited deny. Because like we learned in the previous rule, explicit always overwrites inherited. Doesn't matter what the permission is. So if we had, let's start on this side. If we had a user, this user, let's say, belongs to two groups, group 1 and group 2. In group 1, we have an explicit permission for modify, and let's say that permission was allowed. In group 2, that person had an inherited modify permission that was, in this case, denied. When we take the rule, which one will win? Explicit will always trump inherited. So in the end, that person will have the allow permission. Okay. If we take this same little thing and we just modify it a little bit, we just take out this explicit and this inherited word, and we say in group 1, you had an explicit permission for modify to allow, but in group 2, you had the explicit modify permission to deny. What will happen now? Deny will win, because deny always overrides allow, except explicit allow will always override inherited deny.